Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, November 12th, and we will hear Moving from Aspiration to Action, Reorienting Planners' Values Towards Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the questions box located in your GoToWebinar tool panel. For your content questions for our panelists, you can type those again in the questions box as you think of them, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. And I'll ask that you specify who you would like to answer the question if you have someone specific that you would like to answer. That just helps me in organizing and keeping everything moving fluidly. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our APA chapters and divisions that sponsor us here for 2021. Thanks to all those participating for making these webcasts possible and free to our members. Today we're sponsored by the Urban Design and Preservation Division of APA. So thanks to you all for joining us this year and putting this session together. And you'll hear a little bit more about the division here in just a moment. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our upcoming sessions. We have one more to add, squeezing in here between the November and December dates. We're just waiting on a few more pieces of information. So this is it. This is the lineup for the rest of the year. You can register for these sessions at ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And believe it or not, we're booking well into 2022. Our January and February is completely booked up. So soon you will be able to register for 2022 sessions. So be sure to check back to our website for that. Today's session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing. You can log those credits by heading over to planning.org. You log into your My APA account, and from there, you can search either by today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our website, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. If you're on social media, be sure to like us on Facebook. That's where I post any timely information like a date or a time change or a cancellation. I also will send out a notification when a new batch of sessions are available for you to register for. And I always send little weekly reminders of the sessions coming up at the end of the week. And lastly, we record all of our sessions and we post them onto our YouTube channel. So be sure to subscribe to our channel so that you get notified when I post a new session up there. We have well over 350 sessions. So be sure to take some time to take a look and subscribe to our channel. Again, type your questions in the questions box as you think of them, and we'll get to those at the end during the Q&A. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Jim Barnes, who is a representative for the Urban Design and Preservation Division, and he's going to kick things off. Jim.
Thank you, Christine, and again, appreciate everybody joining us this afternoon. And just a little bit of information related to the Urban Design and Preservation Division. It's an APA division, as you all know, and we generally are very supportive of educational and networking opportunities for the cross-section of the planning population that we generally serve, which are our garden variety planners, urban designers, preservationists in this case, and then we have a lot of allied professions in either the architecture or landscape architecture field as well. And I think one thing that we pride ourselves on as a division of APA is that we try and provide a varied cross-section of continuing education opportunities and try and be creative by bringing in all the different interest groups that basically make up our Urban Design and Preservation Division membership. So hopefully today will not be any exception. I'm confident it will not be, and we're going to cover a lot of ground today. And so without further ado, I'd like to again thank Christine for the opportunity today for the division to present this and introduce our speakers before we get rolling here with the actual meat of this discussion. Again, this is Moving from Aspiration to Action, Reorienting Planners' Values Towards Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And our speakers today include April Jackson, who is an Associate Professor in the Department of Urban Planning and Policy at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And as a practitioner and community engaged scholar, her research focuses on the ways planners can promote racial equity in mixed income communities, workplaces, institutions, and generally by advocating for inclusive, equitable, and just communities. And prior to her faculty position, she has worked as an architect and urban designer on public housing redevelopment projects, neighborhood revitalization plans, and new urbanist communities, both locally here in the United States, in China, and the Middle East. Joining Dr. Jackson this afternoon is Benjamin Christinger, who is an associate professor in the Department of Social Policy and Intervention at the University of Oxford. His research examines the relationship between the built environment and health, specifically focusing on health disparities. He's conducted extensive research on food deserts, examining how development processes, store-level outcomes, and community and customer experiences relate to that topic. He earned a BA in Environmental Sciences and Urban and Environmental Planning and a Master's in Urban and Environmental Planning from the University of Virginia and a PhD in City and Regional Planning at the University of Pennsylvania. We also have joining our speakers today, we have Aujin Lee, who is an assistant professor at Regional and City Planning at the University of Oklahoma. She earned her PhD from UCLA in the Department of Urban Planning, where she was also a research associate for the UCLA Center for Neighborhood Knowledge. In that capacity, her research focuses on residential segregation and racial disparities as it relates to home ownership, wealth, and community institutions. At the same time, she also examines not-for-profits in providing social protections to vulnerable communities and related to uncertain policy circumstances. Lastly, closing out the panel today, we have Anaid Llerena, who is an associate professor at the University of Washington at Tacoma. Her current and future research interests fall within the domain of affordable housing policy, both locally here in the United States and in Latin America. Dr. Llerena holds degrees from the Universidad de Monterrey, Bachelor of Architecture, and the University of California, Irvine, both a Master of Urban and Regional Planning and a PhD. As an architect and planner and researcher, she's interested in public participation processes and activities related to housing, community development, and her research has a strong community-based component that provides knowledge to advocate for and empower disenfranchised groups. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Jackson to go ahead and kick us off. And again, thank you all for joining us today.
You're muted, April.
Okay, is everyone able to see the slides?
Yep, looks great.
Okay, fantastic. Let's see, I think I can't see the slides now. Hold on one second. Okay, great. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. We're really excited to be here today and share work from our recently released report in July of this year, Moving from Aspiration to Action, Reorienting Planners' Values Towards Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So we're just going to sort of give, I think, probably about a 45-minute talk, and we'll start with an introduction and overview of our work, and then highlight three main areas that we really focused on around perspectives on diversity in the workplace, perspectives on experience working with the public, also perspectives on professional education and professional preparation, and then we'll offer some recommendations for the future. So as Jim mentioned, I'm April Jackson. I'm an associate professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and most of my work focuses on racial equity in terms of the built environment with the focus on mixed income communities. I also do quite a bit of equity planning and community engaged based work, and looking at displacement and gentrification in Chicago and Florida, as well as DEI work.
And I'm Ben Christinger. I'm a professor at the University of Oxford, but did all my planning training back in the US. It's good to join you all from the evening here. My work looks at the built environment and health, healthy food access, community development, and some newer work looking at citizen science as a participatory process.
Hi everyone, I apologize. My webcam has been having some issues today, so I'll be joining through audio, but my name is Aujin Lee. So I am an assistant professor at University of Oklahoma, and a lot of my work is focused on immigrant and co-ethnic neighborhoods and racial disparities in homeownership, community institutions, and wealth. And I have some new emerging work on anti-Asian hate crimes that have happened during COVID and planning's response to those issues.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ana Idirina, Associate Professor at the University of Washington in Tacoma, and my work focuses on housing policy and community development. I'm also interested in the work of advocacy organizations to bring about policy change. I also study equitable public spaces and e-governance, and happy to be here with you all today.
Thank you. We also have two colleagues who are unable to make it today that are part of our ACSP-POCIG research team. Dr. Evis Garcia, who's an assistant professor at the University of Utah, and Dr. Andrew Greenlee, who's an associate professor at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. So I just wanted to start with two quotes to kind of frame the discussion for today. Ijeoma Oluo says, "The beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself, and it's the only way forward." And then this quote from Angela Davis, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, where she says, "You have to act as if it were possible to radically transform the world, and you have to do it all the time." And these quotes really speak to the process of change, transformation, and how to move forward. As planners, educators, and students, right, we've been exploring what a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive practice and pedagogies look like, and in what ways we can work towards an anti-racist and decolonial approach to planning. There is no one-size-fits-all approach or quick solutions that will transform the climate for diversity within our workplaces, institutions, and communities we serve, but rather a constantly evolving practice of learning, reflection, and doing the hard work of dismantling racist and colonial systems wherever we find them, and actively doing it all the time, not as an add-on or an afterthought, is a first step in this forever journey. So this journey, I think, has really sort of been revived, right? Particularly last year, 2020, as we saw a global racial reckoning during the spring and summer 2020 nationwide anti-racism protest after the murder of George Floyd in police custody and many other people of color. And that really brought this renewed attention, right, to police brutality, also the growing racial and income inequality that we have here in the United States. Also health disparities, right, were exacerbated by the COVID-19 global pandemic. And we also saw this play out even more so around environmental racism and housing discrimination. So these efforts to sort of respond to that by public and the private sector, we saw investments, right, in EDI initiatives. Also, foundations and institutions have been investing in anti-racism and decolonial research. And more so, the Biden administration has issued a number of policy directives on racial equity, right? So we've seen this renewed commitment to racial justice. So we're in this unique moment in history of racial reckoning, and it's really important for planners to use this right as an opportunity to be proactive and valuing diversity more than ever before. And as we know as planners, right, diversity is important, particularly in this very polarized political and social environment, and it requires a response from higher education and professional planners. Particularly as our work, right, is alongside communities, and our role is to facilitate, right, the development of plans and policies with the goal, right, of transformative efforts that promote equity and anti-racism. We also have a commitment to really redress the harm and continued harm done by the planning field and to confront the exclusionary planning practices, right? Redlining, exclusionary zoning, land use decisions, right, among others. We also have, changing demographics in the United States that we have to respond to, as the US will be a majority minority nation by 2050. So APA has been amplifying and elevating diversity in its work. And in 2018, I'll just sort of highlight a few areas where APA has really been at the forefront. 2018, a diversity inclusion statement was adopted to guide APA by the Diversity Committee. And we use this more expansive definition of diversity that APA uses that is a more inclusive concept that includes both apparent and non-apparent identities. Also, APA in 2019 released the Equity Policy Guide that offers policy recommendations for planners that advance their D&I strategy. And it's really been baked into the Latinos in planning, planning the Black community, the LGBTQ in planning, and women in planning divisions. Also in 2019, APA implemented a mandatory equity-related CM credit for AICP. And in 2020, APA released a statement in response to George Floyd that reaffirmed its commitment to create great communities for all, with the goal of recognizing and eradicating the bad policy decisions of the past. So despite work by APA and also ACSP, representation in the field still lags behind. African American, Latinx, and Asian groups are underrepresented in both the planning programs and in the profession. So just to give a few statistics on that, between 2008 and 2018, the percentage of Black Latinx students increased from 7 to 11%, 8 to 14%, and remained constant at 5% for Asian students. Also, Black and Latinx students are still underrepresented by about 50% compared to the overall population. And this is also reflected in our faculty bodies. Black faculty make up about 8% and Latinx 7.6% of full-time faculty. And furthermore, the planning field is also consistent with this lack of representation. Black planners make up 8% of the field, Latinx 7.7%, Asian 5%, and the field is predominantly white at 75%. So now I'll give just a bit of context about the study and how it came about. ACSP-POCIG, we started working with APA and the APA Diversity Committee in 2017. I really wanted to start to study the climate for diversity for practitioners, which built upon our prior work looking at the climate for diversity for students in urban planning programs that we launched in 2016. And this work aims to really identify where those gaps exist within workplaces, right? To provide more support for practitioners and to think about how we can create more inclusive environments and also better engage with diverse communities. And so by identifying some of these knowledge and practice gaps, APA employers and planning programs can really now better understand, right, how to equip practitioners, train students with more substantive knowledge and critical skills to work with diverse communities. And we also wanted to understand the nuances of how practitioners are experiencing social differences in the workplace, right? And also how to meet the needs of underrepresented groups. So in terms of the research project, we did this in 2 phases. The first phase was a survey of practitioners, and we targeted APA members that were either part or full-time planners. We talked to, or responses in the survey were about 3,000 responses, and that was done between January and March of 2019. And our second phase was interviews of practitioners. And in the survey, we asked for volunteers for interviews. So we had 308 survey participants that volunteered to be interviewed, and we conducted about 104 interviews with planners. And that was done between March and December of 2019. So just a little bit about, sort of who participated in the survey and who we talked to. The geography of planners in terms of sort of the US Census regions predominantly came from the South and the West, and to a lesser degree, the Midwest and Northeast. In terms of race, our survey of practitioners, we had roughly 75% white respondents and 5% Asian, 8% African American, and 8% Hispanic or Latino. And in terms of our interviews with practitioners, we were able to increase the participation of people of color through snowball sampling and more targeted work. So we had representation of 14% Asian planners, 12% African American planners, and 12% Hispanic or Latino planners, but the predominant group did remain white planners at 48%. In terms of gender, it was about even, 48% for both male and female. And the majority of our respondents also were born in the United States. In terms of employment, nearly 42% of planners came from city planning. Also, we had about 18% coming from private consulting firms, 14% coming from the county. And in terms of position level, it was pretty even across senior, mid, and junior level planners, around 30% each, and then fewer entry-level planners at about 9%. So just to kind of give you a preview of what we found, and my colleagues will talk in greater detail about our specific findings, but we found in terms of the workplace climate for diversity that bias and discrimination still continues to persist, particularly for women, people of color, and the LGBTQIA community. Planners reported feeling alienated and having a lack of representation within their organizations, also feeling singled out, right, or tokenized, being the only one in their environments, and this feeling of being hyper visible, right, and having to work twice as hard to have the same expectations or value systems met by white counterparts. Also feeling dismissed and not being taken seriously, as well as being mistreated and having your qualifications questioned. And thinking about working with the public, the majority of our respondents still feel somewhat or very comfortable working with all groups, but planners did identify being the most comfortable engaging with constituents from backgrounds similar to their own. And we also saw this dynamic where female, racial, and ethnic minorities and LGBTQIA individuals experience discrimination from the public and working with the public. In terms of professional practice and education, we found that there were some significant gaps between educational preparation and also professional practice. And the need for more explicit diversity, social justice, decolonial, anti-racist based curriculum that's actually embedded, and again, not sort of an add-on in terms of the planning curriculum. And planners responded in discussing what efforts by organizations have been done to incorporate DEI. 66% of our respondents indicated their workplace didn't regularly implement DEI initiatives. And although planners acknowledged, right, that the value of diversity was important, oftentimes the resources were simply not available to do more substantive work around DEI. And majority of planners also noted a need for more trainings on implicit bias and culturally sensitive practices, for instance. So across the US, as we are continuing these institutional debates regarding how best to support diversity within urban planning curricula and among our students and faculty members and workplaces, transforming the culture of white privilege in workplaces, professional practice, and education does remain one of planning's biggest challenges. Planning still remains sort of behind the curve, and there's a need for training and attention to really create a more inclusive field. And something we continually heard from our planners in interviews is that we have to walk the walk and not only talk the talk to disrupt racist planning practices that reproduce inequities in the workplace and in the communities planners serve. So I will now turn it over to my colleague Anaid to discuss perspectives on diversity in the workplace.
Thank you, April. So as April shared in the introduction, we still found within the interviews a strong presence of bias, harassment, and discrimination based on identity. The 5 categories or themes in which we organized these responses or these types of bias, harassment, or discrimination were tokenism and isolation, mistreatment, questioning of qualifications, stereotyping and profiling as aggressive, and bias in hiring and promotion. And now I will now go through each one of them and provide you some examples as to define what we mean by each one of the terms, as well as provide sample quotes and data from our research. So tokenism is when a small number of people are used to give the appearance that a place is inclusive, which of course then results in isolation of the individual being put in this position. African American and Latinx practitioners felt they were the only one of their identified group and treated as tokens. As some of the respondents said, I am the only person of color at work. I've always been the Black planner. Another one said, I've always been the only Black female in the room, department, and internships in my career. An African-American planner noted that being tokenized while being mistreated in the workplace looked like this, and so they shared a story about her department receiving a diversity award and her supervisor sending her to receive the award, although she believed that her supervisor did not genuinely care and or support racial and ethnic representation, but instead saw the opportunity to use her as a symbol or token of diversity. Here's a quote from that interview. It's also ironic because of the way I was treated there. Accepting the award was kind of, it like goes against each other. Like they have respect for diversity and inclusion in the community or outward facing, but not in practice within the office. Thank you. The second category was mistreatment. So negative treatment based on differences in race or ethnicity. Practitioners described how they had suffered mistreatment outside of the office from officials and community members. To give you an example of a quote at the top, I show up at City Hall and he looks at me and says, you sound different than you look on the phone. An African-American practitioner shared her story of inherent bias and how she was treated differently in person compared to being on the phone. Another Black female planner noted that at a public event with public officials and her white colleagues, that city council members did not shake her hand. She attributed this to differential treatment to the deep-seated racism that exists in the Midwest. So a quote from that interview, I was discriminated against by city council members. They wouldn't shake my hand or take my business card, but they would do so to my coworkers. We were just standing in line shaking hands and they'd skip me over. The example or the theme of questioning qualifications. We found there were strong stereotypes that people of color are considered less qualified. So how did this show up? In questions about their educational qualification and how they got hired into their current positions. And some of these questions might look like this: which planning school did you go to? Show me your portfolio. What have you written before? Like, what's your experience? Again, like try to be requesting that the individual demonstrate their qualifications beyond what is expected of any other colleague. Many prefer to discuss their experience rather. So what we found in the respondents is that they prefer to discuss their experience rather than the schools attended, and most responded coming from working class families or low-income communities. They expressed that they were either overtly surprised or suspicious when they learn about their position, which is a form of stereotyping. And here's an example, a quote from an interview that showed this. A Black male planner explained after he was promoted to executive director the discrimination he experienced. I've had many incidences of questioning my position, both my academic level and professional level. I remember when I first got this position that I'm now in as executive director, and I presented my business card to a municipal official that had just met me for the first time. The official's response was, this couldn't possibly be your title. And then again, another form or another side effect, back to the previous slide, I missed one bullet point at the end, is the feeling of being unworthy and discouraged at these perceptions. Even though the individuals identified that this is discrimination and this is one of the repercussions or one of those negative consequences of having bias and discrimination still present in the workplace, is that despite the individual knowing that it's discrimination, it still makes one feel unworthy and discouraged at these perceptions, which in turn has an impact in one's professional outcomes and career. Thank you. Next slide. The next category is stereotyping and profiling as aggressive. Practitioners reported being stereotyped and profiled in the workplace as being aggressive. For instance, assuming an African American or Latinx male should know about and be prepared to deal with crime. So here's a quote from an interview that exemplifies this theme. My boss told me that she wanted me to be in charge of safety, and I told her I don't know anything about safety and security. And my boss simply told me, you're an African American male. Those drug dealers out there, African American males, relate to you better. African Americans and Latinx planners also were seen as overly aggressive for expressing their views. As a Latina planner said, so I've had moments where people have told me that maybe I'm too aggressive. She believed that her directness, which she learned growing up in a large city, was misinterpreted as not polite in a smaller city. African American planners also acknowledged that they failed to share grievances with supervisors due to fear of being punished professionally, noting that's the nature of being a Black male, I suppose. Many planners explained they couldn't express concerns about bias and discrimination at their organization because they would either be perceived as being angry or the bringing up the grievance could potentially harm their career. Next slide, please. Then there's bias in hiring and promotion. We found the presence of bias and discrimination in the hiring and promotion process, which leads to the underrepresentation, compensation gaps, and unfavorable treatment in promotions. Some planners suggest that there is a more intentional bias in the hiring process and lack of innovative approaches to recruit underrepresented groups. So like this combination, these two forces combined lead to a severe amount of underrepresentation from diverse groups in planning institutions and agencies. Employers rely on the same institutions to support their organizations. And by institutions here, we're talking about the network of maybe master's programs that support their organizations that suggest implicit or explicit bias in selecting applicants that meet cultural norms or white male working environments. Practitioners note the lack of women of color being promoted to leadership positions, and one African American woman who was the first person of color to be promoted to a leadership role in her department said, I might at any given time be the odd duck that walks into the room. African Americans and Latinx planners expressed displeasure at being paid less than their white counterparts. And here are some examples of the quotes on this topic. We've never had an African American planner in the 17 years I've been in this company. We have an African American who does our IT, but he's an outlier. So that's kind of where we are in our office. And it's very frustrating to me. I'm always racking my brain on how to reach out and try to build a more diverse workplace. Another practitioner shared a colleague who was promoted because he was white. He got away with making $80,000 a year. I'm not going to make that in the next 10 years. And I know that he only got that because he was white. Next slide, please. So now I'll pass it on to my colleague, Ben, to share with you about perspectives on experiences working with the public. Thanks, Ben.
Great. Thanks, Anaid. Yeah, so I'm going to cover a variety of findings related to this topic, and so we group them into sort of four main themes. So varying levels of interaction with diverse populations that planners had, the planners' level of comfort engaging with constituents who had backgrounds more similar to them, the finding that women, LGBTQ planners, and planners of color face discrimination in their interactions with the public. And then finally, some themes around inclusion and exclusion in the planning process. Thanks, April. Okay, so we asked planners about perception of professional experiences working with the public and diverse kinds of groups. And we also asked respondents about their comfort level working with a range of diverse groups. By asking these questions, we're able to assess the scope of different experiences in the planning field. The planner's background, experiences, and their own social and cultural background contribute to their feelings of comfort or discomfort in a given environment, which can be compounded by different sociocultural dynamics that exist as various communities are engaged in planning processes. Planners of color may offer some familiarity and further empower individuals and communities from their same background. However, they may also experience instances of being marginalized by colleagues or elected officials from other backgrounds, as we heard in the previous section. We found that apparent forms of diversity, such as gender, age, and race, are the groups most frequently interacted with when planners are reported engaging with the public. Non-apparent or less visible forms of diversity, including income, sexual orientation, and disability, are less frequently addressed when engaging with the public, and that could reflect people's sense that they were less likely to engage with these populations purely on the basis of those characteristics. Many planners spoke candidly about difficulties engaging with certain communities that they are less familiar with, and frequently stated their interest in further developing a relationship to those communities. This also, this theme of negative interactions with the public, we found that female, racial, and ethnic minorities and LGBTQ individuals noted that they experienced discrimination from the public or by city officials. The kinds of issues most frequently described were the perceived lack of qualifications or inability to perform quality work compared to their counterparts. And when these kinds of microaggressions occur, it leaves planners feeling belittled and in a vulnerable in their position of authority. I think this raises a broader question about the workplace supports that might be in place for diverse staff that are being sent out into the communities, to work with the public. Yes, so planners largely agreed that the most important practices for engaging with a diverse public were working with and learning from community members, learning about the cultural background and belief practices of the communities that are engaged, and developing culturally relevant policy solutions to community concerns. The majority of respondents felt somewhat or very comfortable working with all groups. Planners identify being most comfortable engaging with constituents from backgrounds similar to their own, and white respondents were more likely to feel very confident about working with groups of diverse ages or LGBTQ groups. Language was cited often as a barrier to interact with and engage communities that speak languages different than the planners that responded to our survey or interviews. This quote here sort of represents some of what I've been talking about. Yeah, I think I will feel more comfortable in like upper middle class white communities because that's what I grew up in. I grew up in a pretty not very diverse community. So I mean, it's comfortable, it's interesting. When I'm in those communities, I like to look around and think, wow, this is really an exclusive group of people. But I also recognize that I do feel a little bit more comfortable because I know like I have a more of a sense of like how to act, what's appropriate for me to say. In different cultures, it's a little less comfortable for me. Also on the issue of language, we noted from other interviews a lack of sort of resources and support that were made available to have things like language education or even translation services, though this was a sort of key barrier in certain communities. And next slide, please. Thanks, April. Oftentimes, planners experience challenges getting all groups within a community to participate in the planning processes due to time and resource constraints, and this can be made worse by public mistrust that's been created by past failures of the planning field. These are some of the same people who are reluctant to trust the formal planning process and could require additional time and effort to build trust. Planners may bring up the lack of diversity and inclusion of the public to their coworkers or supervisors, but depending on the climate of their work environment and its capacity to undertake those initiatives, those requests could be fruitless. So these quotes sort of illustrate some of that challenge. In my office, I took the initiative, and sometimes behind closed doors, I raised certain concerns about issues in terms of my optics of a situation and sometimes those perspectives were dismissed in terms of my views on diversity and in terms of meeting the needs of a diverse public. And I think for those that have been disenfranchised for many over the decades, I think it's hard to reach them, hard to work with them because they're so reluctant to participate because of many times trying to do something, or they haven't been involved with it, haven't been involved in the process before. So there's a real recognition here that there's sort of a challenge in reaching diverse communities. And then also sometimes when issues are raised within a planning department, that those challenges aren't necessarily met with solutions or support for potential solutions. So I'm going to transition now to talking a bit about perspectives from the interviews and survey on professional education and professional preparation for work, to work in diverse communities. So the high level sort of summary that we have, so about half of our respondents to the survey were satisfied with their planning education and training for working in diverse communities. We did identify several gaps in this sort of education and training for this. So there's space between planners' values that we sort of talk about in our ethics and ideals and code of ethics, and then the curricula that are being offered in planning programs, and then also that planning actions that we have to undertake as planning professionals. Respondents talked about limited on-the-job training for working in diverse communities and raised the need for APA and ACSP to engage with more advocacy efforts related to these initiatives. So, thanks, April. So one of the key issues, this gap between these ethics and ideals and planning education and planning practice. So recognition that we sort of a failure to acknowledge the gap that still exists between these goals and the aims of equity as a core value and the actual implementation of that in planning practice. So there's this issue of in the planning classroom, so what is being offered, what kinds of courses are being offered, and then moving from the planning classroom to the planning profession. So in how to take those lessons into the field around equity planning, advocacy planning, how does that look in practice, and what can planning educators do to sort of help people move into sort of practice roles and act out on those values and ideals. There's also some discussion that in planning education really lacks a deep engagement on race, identity, and culture, and planning educators should think about that as they're constructing new curricula and thinking how to equip planners to move into diverse communities and serve them. So this really gets to that. We really need to focus on planners education, i.e. how and what we learn about the history of our profession, how it shaped our society, and equitable access to opportunity or lack thereof. Yeah, so this quote really just being sort of a call to action that like planners as a profession and also planning educators as training the sort of future planners need to be called into this mission of thinking about grappling with our history and also being future looking. Next slide, please. Great. So another theme was around the limited workplace initiatives to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. So about 66% of respondents indicated that their workplace did not regularly implement diversity or inclusion initiatives, and that the value of diversity is acknowledged, but oftentimes the resources might not be available to follow through with implementing those initiatives. Majority of respondents noted a need for more trainings on things like implicit bias, culturally sensitive practices, or how to accommodate difference in planning processes. And it should note a few respondents outwardly oppose diversity, as it in the words of one participant, amounts to racial, sexual, ethnic favoritism, while marginalizing other groups such as low middle class whites or reverse discrimination. So while this was not sort of like overwhelming view, that this was something that a participant felt like they needed to communicate to us as researchers. A more common view is the one on the right. So this person said, we've done every webinar that we can find for free about implicit bias and kind of diversity and equity in planning. We're doing everything we can in a fairly cost-effective manner. I think that shouldn't be voluntary and should just be part of what everybody gets trained in. I mean, I think the way that we have ethics training for APA, there should also be credits that you get for equity, race, and anti-racism. That piece should just be called out as a core competency of what we do, because there's no other way to move our society forward for those of us who are at the forefront. Next slide, please. Great. So we also look to measure the awareness of some ongoing APA and ACSP diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. So about 82% of respondents were aware of APA's population divisions, and that might include planning in the Black community division, the LGBTQ division, planning in women, Latinos in planning, and the tribal planning interest group. ACSP also has population interest groups, and a similar percentage of respondents were aware of those. However, only 56% of respondents were, or 56% of respondents were unaware of the APA Ambassador Program, which is a mentorship program that's designed to bring in and inspire the next generation of planners. And we didn't see any differences there by white and non-white status. So it's a bit of a mixed bag here in terms of a broader understanding and awareness of some key diversity, equity, and inclusion interest groups within APA and ACSP. But there was also a sort of stated desire for more and for more actionable or sort of active ACSP and APA initiatives. Next slide, please. So core to that, and core to that request for more initiatives was initiatives on advocacy. So the majority of planners indicated that they wanted to see APA provide support for diversity and inclusion through increased advocacy, followed by legislative and educational priorities as key action items. We asked this question in a similar way for ACSP, with, again, advocacy rising to the top of the list for what planners wanted to see more of from their professional organizations. So while we note that APA and ACSP are doing modest programs, planners, and the ones that we spoke with, wanted their professional associations to take a more active political role, advocating for more effective diversity and inclusion efforts. And some of that I think we'll discuss in the next section on the recommendations that we have for the future. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Ajin.
Thanks, Ben. So we got a lot of great recommendations from our participants overall. Folks had a lot to say about what they think could improve with the field. So first, we'd like to start with recommendations that folks had for APA and AICP. And part of the recommendations, like this quotation here shows, is thinking about how to redefine what maybe are qualifications. So Anaid had mentioned that a stereotype is that particularly those of underrepresented diverse identities are not assumed to have the proper qualifications, but trying to include those who have more lived experiences too. And so part of it from the organizational standpoint is to reorient the advocacy, as Ben had just mentioned, particularly around anti-racist and inclusive efforts and policies. What April had mentioned earlier, there's been this ongoing communication about that's starting to happen in our field about the role that planning has had to reinforce systemic structural racism, and so continuing those efforts. And there was a big need that folks had mentioned about either adjusting the cost or developing a more equitable fee structure that would then not only include more diverse planners, non-traditional planners, to attend the conference, but also perhaps to help support them in general to attend trainings. And that would particularly also help those who work in the nonprofit sector or smaller planning organizations with fewer resources. So in addition, as Ben had mentioned, there was a call for a lot more resources around these topics. So one way would be to embed within APA conferences these similar types of activities or free trainings around EDI issues. And with the certification maintenance program, particularly it's trying to strengthen focus on anti-racism and cultural competency within the particular equity certification that's relatively new with AICP. And also we need to reach out to the elected officials or public officials that our planning offices work with. So trying to implement particularly trainings with them. And that can also, similar to what we're doing here, right, curating more online materials, not only to help guide what we can do, but also highlight what is already happening to highlight folks already doing a lot of this great work. And finally, then to support APA chapters that want to look at EDI strategies. So this quotation here shows an example of something small that one particular planning department did. So they started a Department of Race and Equity, started a series of monthly lunch and learns about race. But then the rest of the quotation talks about how trying to move beyond just a few people who are talking about race and inequity. So some of these recommendations would help with that. Next slide, please. Also for the workforce, working with local APA chapters to develop similar EDI committees. A big thing for those who are already existing in planning departments would be to evaluate the composition of employees, and then also to help those with promotion within leadership positions and to advocate for particularly diversifying planning commissions. Another set of recommendations were about creating awards that would then again also help to highlight excellence in EDI and be able to then show case studies where folks are really doing this work. To then also on the right side here to help to develop community capacity around EDI issues. Again, trying to do some kind of forum at APA conferences. We also recommend more regularly conducting similar climate studies like the one that we're presenting here, perhaps every 3 years. Then that would help APA and planning organizations to be able to track over the long term what are the representational demographics of the field. And then again, learning from those on the ground who are already doing this work in communities and neighborhoods to then strengthen planning's capacity to do diverse engagement work. Next slide, please. Sorry, so for moving on to then employers, so similar recommendations with the existing workforce, not only expanding training opportunities, but developing some kind of strategic plan to then help employers to guide EDI efforts. And then also with their engagement work to then do some kind of assessment to see what the impact is on their residents. Similarly, with some of the organizational recommendations on recruitment, trying to identify how to diversify your workforce from non-traditional sources or allied fields to then expand those who are considered, who are then applicants, and then evaluate who is getting promoted, who is being able to have more opportunities in the workforce, and then once again, developing some partnerships with community groups or workshops of folks who are already doing this work on the ground. So the next slide talks really about similar things about tokenism and how to start these conversations. So this person stated, we need opportunities for conversation. If people can speak from their experience, that would be maybe build better, just build that empathy so people understand what it's like. Just like for me, being the only Black person or only person calling the office, I don't think many people have experienced that. So what that feels like and like how you can't relate to certain people in different ways, that would be eye-opening. And also, as Ben had mentioned, we have identified some gaps within educational institutions. So some of these recommendations are for us too. Within our own programs, a lot of universities have reaffirmed commitments around EDI from last summer. And so a lot of that work is to help diversify curriculum offerings to then help really bridge from the education to practice pipeline. And in our courses, building connections with community engagement, participatory planning, and to require those, not just make it an elective. And similarly, I think some of our departments are already doing, but trying to develop an institutional strategic plan to help guide student, faculty, staff, administrators on these DEI goals. And just like the workforce, we need to continue to recruit and retain students and faculty of diverse backgrounds, and then to institutionalize different types of professional development to then increase and support this pipeline of diverse students into the workforce. So I wanted to end my section with this quotation here that talks about really trying to build planning also from the ground up. So this person stated, we can continue to recruit people from communities that we serve and recruit people that have more diverse language and experiential backgrounds so that we have more planners that reflect the rich diversity of our jurisdiction. It goes back to getting planners on the street level, embedding planners into the fabric of the neighborhood, having embedded planners working on the ground, working from the street level and being present. So I think this really reflects our ultimate goal of trying to then build more equitable neighborhoods from the ground up. So I'll finally turn it over back to April.
Thank you, Ajin. So I'm going to wrap up just sort of talking about some broader implications of the work that we've been talking about today. But what we did find is that, the learning environment is very much reproduced in a professional setting between coworkers. And the findings were quite consistent with what we found happening in urban planning programs with our students. And so the climate in the office, right, does not change with just, right, merely increasing diverse representation, right? That's not enough. The climate remains hostile and unwelcoming, right, to planners of color. So we really need to push the boundaries with doing more integrated approaches to creating inclusive environments. Also, discrimination and microaggressions in the workplace, as Anaid discussed, really damages the confidence, right, in the sense of belonging for people of color, and makes it difficult, right, to be successful and to, again, sort of work towards, promotions and leadership positions. And also implicit biases, right, prevent very capable and effective workers from achieving upward mobility in terms of promotion, particularly what we heard about in terms of the bias and discrimination that happens in the workplace and the lack of promotion to leadership positions for female and people of color. So we need to move from diverse representation to really inclusion. And workplaces that lack inclusive environments will continue to struggle to really attract and retain professionals of color unless strategies are undertaken, right, to really work on the environment in our workplaces, institutions, and organizations. The rationale for recruiting and retaining a more diverse workforce, right, is to be able to have the workforce reflect the communities that planners are serving, right? Again, as we're becoming a much more diverse society, right, our workforce also needs to reflect those changes. And, planning has a long way to go, where planners of color, at least from those that we spoke with and interviewed, right, where they're not only represented, but they feel validated, right, and also included in their workplace. And one limitation of our work is that we use the APA database, right, which we know does not have much representation of people of color and Indigenous and Native planners. So we do need to do more expanded research and work and follow-up studies, particularly on understanding the experience of Indigenous and Native experiences for planners. So in terms of next steps, we have a series of publications and projects. One is this report that was released. We also have a publication in JAPA entitled Feeling Like an Odd Duck, and that's the experiences of African American, Black, and Latino planning practitioners. That's the first paper released in the series out of this report. And we also have a JAPA special issue in progress entitled Anti-Racist Futures, Disrupting Racist Planning Practices in Workplaces, Institutions, and Communities. So feel free, I believe Christine is dropping those links in the chat to check those out, and feel free to reach out to any of us with questions or discussion. So thank you very much. And we'll turn it back over to Christine for any questions.
Wonderful, thank you. And yeah, I just dropped all of the links, the report, executive summary, the JAPA paper, all of the links are in the little chat function questions box in your GoToWebinar tool panel. Okay, so like I mentioned before, type your questions in your questions box and we'll see if we can get to them. We do have several coming in already. And if my panelists want to go ahead and turn their cameras back on, and let me turn off. I'm just going to take controls back, April. So I just took them. So now we don't see our screen anymore. Okay, so in terms of the study, can you clarify what percentage of those that were asked to participate in this study actually responded?
Sure. So in terms of the survey, the responses that we received, I think the survey was sent out to roughly 38,000 APA members, and we received about a 4% response rate on that. And then of those that selected into being interviewed, we had about 308 individuals, and we interviewed 104. So that was a response rate of about 10%.
Okay, there are some questions about that, specifically, I guess, and I'm trying to put my stats hat on. Is that a significant enough number for the study? And how do we approach that to folks that might be skeptical that it's only 10% of the people that you even studied? What, how is that significant? How do we work through that?
Sure. So I can make a few points and then turn it over to our stats guy, Benjamin. But when we did the sort of comparison, there is a piece in the report that it was compared to prior surveys done and sort of the APA composition that APA does research on, and we found that it was comparable. So that's what we sort of used as a baseline to ensure that the results were comparative against the APA population. Feel free to add to that, Ben.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add, just to say that, in terms of like, I think like statistical, like sort of power analysis, which is maybe done more often to sort of look at, do you have enough people in your study to look at a change over time or something like that? That wasn't really like the aim of the study, of the survey. So we didn't like do a sort of power analysis or anything like that for the survey. But as April said, the response that we got was similar to what has been gotten in the past. I guess I would just add too, from like a qualitative perspective, I mean, doing over 100 interviews is really sort of beyond what most sort of qualitative studies do. And actually that was a big undertaking by the team and a lot of graduate research assistants to sort of do that work and make sense of all of that data that was collected over many months.
So, and I guess, and to that point of those interviews, the question is, I really appreciate that you provided examples of experiences from professionals who experience exclusion in the workplace and working with the community. Can you give us any talking points to respond when some people dismiss these experiences as anecdotal, cherry picking, or oversensitive? These are some hard questions for you guys. We are just jumping right in.
I'm happy to take that one.
Okay.
I would say that even if it were, these very unique experiences, though, that should not be anybody's experience in the workplace, period. So the fact that they're present, the fact that they're showing up, the fact that somebody feels felt that saying because of your race, you should be qualified to deal with crime. I mean, so we should all be looking internally in figuring out, okay, maybe I haven't been as egregious as that, but what are the ways in which my bias, my colorism, my anti-Blackness shows up in how I navigate my professional climate? And unfortunately, for those of us that are of any one of these marginalized groups, ethnicities, or races, we know it's prevalent. Like, so having members from these groups will help dispel the myth that is that, well, it only happened in, well, only that person would say that. It's like, actually, unfortunately, no, it's prevalent. It's part of the climate. And as my colleagues shared, it's part of society. So like none of the institutions in our society is above being a racist environment. And so we all have to be actively working towards reducing, and that's why we talked about reorienting planners' focus into, rather than saying, well, it's something that we took a training, so we're done. It's like, no, how do I show up this morning with the intent to make sure that my biases don't impact my colleagues every day, and the communities that I'm working in. So that would be my response to someone who might feel that way.
I'd love to add to that. Thanks so much, Anaid. I think also we underscore implicit biases and microaggressions, particularly in the planning field. And, you know, that there are things that are right sort of in that gray area. You know, do you know if it's happening? Is it really happening? Right. But I think that as someone like myself, that every day, right, I face microaggressions every single day as a Black woman, right? Walking in a room and, you know, being considered unqualified, right, for any work that I'm doing. And, you know, is that intentional or is that a bias, right? And I think that as we as planners are trying to move forward in this area, right, let's take a beat, right? And let's check our biases. Let's make sure we know what they are, be aware of them so that we can make the adjustments in real time. And that takes time to do, you know, to know that they're there, right? Step back and then say, okay, how might that have influenced what I said or the decisions that I'm making?
The only other thing that I would add to that is, and I might be mixing up a survey, because we did another survey before this one where we looked at planning students and their experiences with diversity, the environment for diversity in their departments. And one finding there was that white students didn't see the same things happening as their colleagues who were people of color. Right, so there, as April was saying, like there's this moment of maybe like having a beat to sort of check our biases, and you know, as a white person, one of those biases includes like that I am not seeing these things that are happening to my colleagues who are people of color, right? So there's maybe an additional thing to do there of like listening, and I think one thing that we tried to do in the survey was like elevating those experiences of people who did face these things in the workplace.
To that, I really liked and kind of did a screenshot of one of the quotes from the very beginning. The beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racist. It's the commitment to fight it wherever you find it, including in yourself. So how do we know? What if we assume that we're not biased? What if we think that we're doing everything, you know, as we should? And how do we figure out if we do have built-in biases that we don't realize are biases?
I mean, I would start with, it's not an if question. I wish it were. I wish there were like this group of people that somehow existed in this society, in this planet, and were able to be free of bias. So I would start there with like, it's not really a question of if. It's like, where is my bias? What is my bias about? And then what can I do? Like, it's increasing that self-awareness. That's the very first step. because otherwise you can't address, you know, those areas where you're biased. And I also wanted to make sure that since we don't see our colleague Aljeen, please feel free to just jump in and interrupt at any point if you have something to add to the conversation.
Thanks. I do want to build off what you just shared, and part of it is our brains are, you know, taught to categorize the world in certain ways to help us easily process information. And so, like Anna said, part of it is it's just built into how we literally are going around in the world and our lived experiences. And I really liked the quotation that Ben had shared about the white planner who grew up in the middle income neighborhood and then coming back later realizing that that's a very exclusive environment and checking that that person didn't feel comfortable in other types of environments. And it's not to say that that person cannot be a planner for other types of neighborhoods. Part of it is just then you're implementing additional steps. I think part of it too is there are great pieces now in JAPA and JAPER about some of this work. Miriam Solis has a great short piece for those of you who don't want to read a 23-page article on racial equity in planning organizations, and that article talks about, you know, we talk about race neutrality, like can we even talk about difference without feeling uncomfortable? And highlighting that difference, which I teach to my students, is not the problem. It's not being able to even talk about difference to start with. And so there's, you know, we're all working hard to publish some of this stuff too, and I think part of it's just reading, and if something does kind of resonate, maybe it flags something that's you know, makes you reflect, I think that's a great place to start. And like other folks said, listening to other planners, but you know, also recognizing they may or may not feel as comfortable, especially if they are kind of more of a subordinate position, right? Which is part of why we did this survey.
Yeah, and I'd like to add to that, you know, part of, you know, this journey, right, which is, it's tough, it's challenging, it can be emotionally, you know, and sort of mentally taxing. Something that I've certainly learned, I think, in working with our students, right, is that, you know what, we just have to be comfortable being uncomfortable, right, and move forward, dig in, because it's in those conversations that I think we start to have some better understandings of people, right, and think of people as humans, right, and start to move forward. But unless we're really doing that uncomfortable work, you know, I think it's hard to move forward.
Thank you. Let's talk some definitions. When we think of DEI, I personally, I immediately think of your race, your ethnicity, maybe your gender, your sexuality, even your age, perhaps. But I feel like that there are, and in one of your, you kind of had a definition in one of your early slides about it's not limited to race, ethnicity, class, gender, age, sexuality, ability, educational attainment, spiritual beliefs, creed, culture, tribal affiliation, nationality, immigration status, political beliefs, veteran status. I feel like we don't talk about most of those. So where does that fall in line? You know, I question if in our webcast last week, we were talking about design, and I brought up specifically those that have special needs. For example, if you're on the spectrum, the autism spectrum. So let's use that for an example, because for anyone who was on the line last week, you know that we had just been talking about that. What about them? What about these other groups? You know, we're really focusing high level on, you know, race and ethnicity and sexuality. But what do we do about all the other forms of diversity that are a little less, you know, not in the spotlight?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I can sort of speak to just, I think, some of the limitations of our work that, you know, has come out in other settings, certainly. The way that we sort of have approached a lot of it is to separate out perspectives of white and non-white respondents, and then what statistically is significant, right? And that tends to guide or direct, right, where you're then delving deeper. And so something, again, that our study, lacks is, right, we did do interviews with those people with disabilities, right? However, it didn't come out as being statistically significant, and so it doesn't necessarily, right, sort of rise to the top of the discussion. We also, in terms of the work, again, pulled from the APA database, right, which is predominantly white, predominantly male. So we have left out a lot of those, right, experiences and perspectives, which we really do need to look more in depth at so that we can elevate and amplify those experiences. So I just want to sort of say that that's certainly a limitation of our work. And feel free, others, to jump in on that comment.
I would add that, the importance of intersectionality. And so having this, we see this as the beginning of the work, not like the end. Oh yeah, this has been done. We talk about the need for continued and periodic check-ins with APA membership. Part of that is to build the possibility for looking at things at these, the bias and discrimination intersectionally. Yet we have to start with some categories, and these are the categories that we started with. So race, gender, and sexuality are three of those major categories that then we look at intersectionally with ability, immigration status, country of origin, all these other things.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, please, Ben, go ahead.
I was just going to add, I mean, one thing that we do have going is sort of discussions with how to continue these kinds of surveys into the future. And well, I think there is some, interest in like having some continuity between years of doing surveys. Like I think, as Ani was saying, it's like this is just a beginning point, and certainly from feedback from planners, from the community, like what needs to be surveyed, what needs to be monitored, like these other aspects of identity could certainly be part of a future survey too. So I just want to mention that.
Great. Well, we look forward to it. This is a great idea. Someone typed in, it would be interesting and maybe telling if, as part of CM training for AICP, that planners would be offered a type of quiz or a test to better understand their biases. So really would be sort of two ways. One, you would be able to understand what your biases are. And then two, that type of information could be reported back, as data, for future study. That's, I thought that was kind of interesting.
Sure. So if you want to test your bias, there's an IAT test that Harvard offers. I do that in a lot of my classes as well. So that's one really great source. There are a few others as well that you can take to sort of get a baseline on your implicit biases.
Great. This question, we'll start with you, April. This question is, do you look at these issues in Canada where whatever racism exists there, and it clearly exists, is not rooted in the institution of slavery?
Fantastic question. I think we can all sort of speak, to that. But I'd say most of my work comes out of, right, sort of structural racism in the US context, right? So I am certainly unfamiliar with the Canadian context in that respect. And so that's been sort of where my focus has, particularly been in this work.
Anyone else have anything on that? Okay. How can we get more diversity in our planning field? Where does it start?
I think, oh my gosh, I think it starts in what we choose to do as professionals when we're looking to do outreach and engagement for future generations of practitioners. So I'm thinking of the activities that could be sponsored through APA that I know in other fields. There are practitioners that go to middle schools and talk about the work that, you know, that a person in that profession does. They also invite members of the community into their professional spaces, whether it's at the city or at a city agency or a private firm, to make sure that there is that they're building networks from very early on with the community, or members from broadly defined members from communities that surround the field, so that there is more familiarity from the broader public about what the field is, and being very intentional about who we're reaching out to. What neighborhoods in my city might I need to have a presence in that I don't? And I need to have a presence in because I know that those are the areas where there's a lot of immigrant residents, or because that's an area that has been, you know, that still is feeling the impacts of redlining over the, because we all have those maps in our cities that it's like, really, we see how that those decisions made in the early half of the first half of the last century, to this day, those repercussions have been magnified. And so we know where those places are. And so as a profession, those are the places where we should be intentional about having a presence. And by having a presence, I mean showing up, participating in their events, participating in the community building and activities in those spaces, so that, again, we're fostering relationships. And it's not going to be easy, it's not going to happen overnight, but it's an investment that I think, well, it's long overdue. And now we see the cost that we're paying for not having done it earlier. And so that is one of those things that we could start doing. And I know that that's something that can start happening also in graduate programs. And as practitioners here, you have connections, you do have leverage with your home institution, the institution you graduated from. And so reaching out to them and asking or offering, like, so what are you doing? And is there some way that I could get involved in those efforts? That would be something that I know community members would appreciate, of hearing more from our field.
I guess from an academic, like, what can we do in academia too? I mean, I think like, again, both this survey and then I think the previous survey that we did with planning students, the importance of having diverse faculty, like, cannot be understated in this, and both in terms of like having visibility and also, like, yeah, like mentorship opportunities for students. Like, we don't just want to like recruit diverse students to become planners and learn planning. We want them to be successful, like happy, like future planners, right? It's not just like getting the numbers up, right? It's like, how do those students become successful and then graduate to be successful planners? Yeah, and I mean, just, like, thinking about like my own experience, like learning about planning, it was literally an intro to planning 101, and having a faculty member who sort of made planning seem interesting and important to me, and something that, like, I just wanted to learn more about and get involved with. And I imagine many of us have those sorts of stories. And we know from the like research that we've done and other research that having diverse faculty is a really important way to support diverse student populations, to sort of take those classes and feel supported in that.
I was just reminded of a webcast that we had earlier this year. Their acronym is YEP. It's Youth Engagement Planning. Let me see if I can find it. It was really interesting. It literally, it's all about getting youth interested in their community. So regardless if they even become planners or not, or an allied professional, just the whole concept of understanding what a community is, what a community should be, and how everyone benefits from it, so that whatever they do in life, that, they take that sort of core philosophy with them, and that, for kids all over. Actually, let me see if I have it. Oh, here it is. It was from August 27th, and it's called, Yep, The Power of Youth. So it was put on by the Women in Planning Division. So if you go to our YouTube channel, you can view that. It was just really interesting. I think we're going to wrap up here because it's just about 2:30 Eastern. This was a good conversation, and I appreciate all the work that you all have done and for sticking with me as I ask some kind of hard questions. And you know, this type of conversation can be awkward, and I think it was April who said, you know, we just need to get used to sometimes being uncomfortable about this, and it is what it is. So I thank you all for doing this solid work, and I look forward to future reports. And this session is being recorded. We're posting it. We'll have it on our YouTube channel. We'll also have a PDF of the slide deck available on our website, ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. The links to the report are here in the chat box. If you don't get a chance to jot them down, you can do so just by reviewing the webcast that'll pop up. So with that, thanks to the Urban Design and Preservation Division for sponsoring today, and to all of our panelists. We appreciate you, and we thank you for all of your hard work. And everyone have a great weekend. We'll talk next time.
Thank you.
Likewise,
Bye-bye.
thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.